So, hello, thanks for inviting me, and especially the last lecture was extremely interesting for my work, and I hope to read more about this psychological effect on home and house. Maybe in my lecture you find out that there is a difference between both. My name is Mathieu Wellner. I'm also from Innsbruck University, like Bettina Schlorhofer an hour ago. Please actually also visit our website, architecturaltheory.eu. What I will talk about is I call it inside megastructures. Of course, the question of how we will live in the future is as old as the first dwelling itself. So endless concepts have been made by architects how this future life would look like. And let's say megastructures are the most visible of these concepts of how a future life could be. I will focus on actually two main characters. Leopold Gerstl and Jonas Friedman. Both are two totally different parts of my two research projects. One with Leopold Gerstl is together with the Technion in Haifa, is about theory and practice of this architect, Leopold Gerstl. And the second research is about, for one example, Jonas Friedman is about the architect and his role as a public intellectual, where I have a series of interviews, and one of them is Jonas Friedman. This is Leopold Gerstl, who recently died, and this research cooperation with Technion will end with a exhibition and a catalogue. It's interesting for us at Innsbruck University because this particular architect used to be professor for more than 10 years. So my focus in this research project is about his, more or less his Austrian years, theoretically, and of course his practice too. This is maybe one of his most famous projects, the Ziggurat project of the early 1960s. The other one is Jonas Friedman, a few years older than Gerstl, but still living. He's born in Budapest, escaped to Palestine, studied together with Gerstl at the Technion, and moved to Paris. He's there ever since, and interestingly enough, he's still active as an architect and as a public intellectual. His most known project is, of course, La Ville Spatiale, the spatial city, a kind of large-scale modular canopy that would be kind of suspended above towns or above anything. What they have in common, Friedman and Gerstl, of course, is Israel or Palestine. Both have typical biographies of 20th century Jews, escaped from Holocaust, moved to Palestine, studied at the Technion as young Israelis, had Bauhaus professors, so they have a common history. But to understand their work, especially their work in the early 1960s, and for this I think the lecture before, the early 60s play an important role on perception of space. I make a brief, very brief, kind of historical overview of what happened, especially in Haifa. This is an image of the early Technion, like the only first place where architecture was possible to study in Israel, in young Palestine even. And this is an enigmatic image because I wanted to show the kind of eclecticism of architectural styles. So the first settlers who came to Palestine, came to this kind of Ottoman region, found a kind of uncultivated desert ground. I mean, it was almost nothing. And they arrived in this province full of poverty. And those 2,000 years of diaspora left the Jewish people without any architectural background, because they were kind of spread all over the world. And the settlers arriving, tried to find a new own style. But two things. I mean, they first looked at those things their ancestors did before, and then of course they looked at what they found, the Arabic villages, this tradition, plus everybody's background from each different country and culture where they were living. So this made a kind of eclecticism, kind of oriental eclecticism, and even this building from a Berlin architect made 100 years ago shows in a way this there was a little bit of everything. Tel Aviv, of course, new city, 100 years old, under British mandate. Of course, Patrick Gaddis plays the role, made a kind of planning for 40,000, now it's used for 1 million people, but this is the kind of new town idea, which is inside an almost existing urbanity with Jaffa. Interesting is that at the Technion in the late 30s, a lot of Bauhaus professors were teaching because there was a mass immigration to Palestine in the 30s and post-war. And this is interesting because this kind of Bauhaus ideology, it fitted perfectly with Zionism. So this left-wing kind of socialist Bauhaus ideology was very interesting. Create a state and create a human being and create this environment were fitting together also with the social reform of the left-wing parties. The kibbutzim is just one of the examples where functionalism, reduction of kind of form, and the existence minimum play together in one. The result were this kind of monochrome, mostly kind of orthogonal flat roofs, concrete, balcony, pilotis houses like you see in Tel Aviv. Now walking in Tel Aviv, in one single street, you have more Bauhaus buildings than in whole Germany. Right? So this is a kind of typical post-war architecture that you still see now. After 48, I mean, another kind of mass immigration. And the interesting thing where I want to come to is that this was the moment when the Shikun were kind of realized. Shikun is a kind of a social housing typology. It's important because in that period of the late 40s, beginning of the 50s, more than 30 new towns were founded in Israel. And the state propaganda tried to avoid big cities. So it was not the idea of making Haifa, Jerusalem, and Tel Aviv grow, but to occupy the whole territory. It was a like kind of colonialization of the whole territory by putting this kind of shikun, or like you would say, that's not homes, that's houses. Yeah, put the houses in the middle of the desert. And people felt really isolated and kind of imprisoned in those shikun buildings. Especially because they were living there and had to work in the cities. So there was a lot of traffic, a lot of transit, and not only for work, but also no leisure. It was actually sleep cities spread all over the country. Yeah? In search of alternatives to that shikun, to those shikuns, in the middle of nowhere, a lot of different architects from the Technion who had Bauhaus professors like Neumann, Zvi Hecker and others tried to work on different forms. Here, a kind of very famous polyhedric architecture, but also tried to an analysis of natural forms, tried mathematical experiments, and so on. That is, of course, not a simple, only Israeli way, but a lot of those experiments, which were made worldwide, were really realized in Israel. So those new technologies like prefabrication became standard in that very young country. And the concrete was a very important material because the concrete was felt like an Israeli material. So it was modern. And that was, of course, in opposition to the Palestinian buildings who were with simple materials. So material became a kind of ideology. And in this context, you have to see those young architects, Leopold Gerstl and Jonah Friedman. This kind of demographic pressure to build soon, fast houses in the middle of nowhere. So that comes, then you come to the idea, to the point, what is housing? What is housing for the masses, or in general? So the lecture here with home and house different was very, very telling. For French novelist Georges Perec, housing is just doing the same things like others do. Right? In his book La vie mode d'emploi, life, a user's manual. He begins this book with a description of inhabitants of an apartment building, and even though they are separated by walls, they are doing the same things at the same time in the same building, but also doesn't do it in simultaneous existences in other buildings in the same street or in the same city. Or if you look at the image of Gursky of the Montparnasse building, you can kind of think of Sloterdijk, who thinks that an apartment is at the same time a stage and a cave. So it has a kind of double function. It allows a kind of performance, so you can perform like on a stage in your apartment, but simultaneously you can go back to total significance at the same time. Of course, think of the unité d'habitation, the kind of machine à habiter, the housing machine, where you have as well the kind of caves, but also with those interior streets you have also the stage. The hybrid becomes here one machine. The idea of the minimal modernism also came with the experience of Le Corbusier visiting the Certosa Dema in Florence, or a monastery, and where he said he would like to live inside one of those cells his own life. And finally you can see the kind of standalone building with public space, inside the building with the rue intérieure, on top of the building with the solarium, but also on the ground floor. Habitats here 9 and 10 were of course also focusing on that. Just think of the projects of Team 10. Here a very famous project by the Smiths and the Golden Lane project. They presented in Aix-en-Provence, and those cluster blocks should present dense, woven, complicated aggregations with a kind of expressive structure. This is a collage showing that even this building had a kind of inside road, a street as only public space, a street as a provider of social facilities, and that came of course from the working class neighborhoods where the street were the only public place for the life of the workers. So the street was as well a place of assembly, but also the children's playground. Here a collage with Marilyn Monroe and Joe DiMaggio. Then metabolism, of course, at the same time, late 50s, but especially starting in 1960 with the World Conference in Tokyo. Kurokawa's book for the proposal for new urbanism plays a crucial role. Metabolism being a kind of a city in constant change, in constant alteration, but a flexible and growing architecture for a kind of processual society, for a society who is changing over time, and the result were kind of huge linear structures which would kind of change to the existing historical city centers. Here a project by Kurokawa with the cluster in the city, a cluster which by the way is a term Kevin Lynch brought into architecture in the mid-50s. Or here Isozaki playing also with cells with the project cluster in the air, but you have to think of Kenzo Tange's plan for Tokyo Bay, which would be one of the greatest. Mega Year 65, this is one chapter in Rainer Benham's book Megastructures, to show that in 1965 so many different things happened. Just think on Archigram 5, where they made a collage with different megastructures, and one of those structures is here on the right in the middle, is Leopold Gerstel's Ziggurat next to Isozaki and Suraj, etc. Archigram at the same time, here on Eretz, a walking city was an idea in this period, as well as Peter Cook's, also archigrams, a plug-in city. But also at the same time, with those very utopist projects, Architecture Without Architects from Budowski, which showed an architecture made without architects, for whose only reason is a kind of functionality, function. Structuralism, Van Eyck, or here Blom, the Caspar project, where, so these things were all happening at the same time, and everything was the thought about what is home, what is a space, and what is mass housing. The super and pop architects like Super Studio here with the New York City sketch or the New York City